So this is where people end up when they can't keep a real job, Claire Donovan said, laughing thinly as the small bakery's door swung shut behind her. The man in the flour-dusted apron beside the oven was Ben Callahan, the single father she had fired weeks earlier for taking a few days off to care for his sick mother. She remarked almost sweetly that he had finally found work baking for someone else. Ben only smiled. He never mentioned that he owned this place, or that within days the whole country would know his name. Ben Callahan had spent 11 years learning the difference between a thing that was almost right and a thing that was exactly right. And the difference had never once made him rich. At Crestline Foods, he ran quality control on a factory floor the size of 2 football fields, walking the line before dawn while the ovens were still cold, tasting, measuring, sending back whole batches when a crust came out a shade too pale. Men twice his age called him careful. Younger ones called him slow. He answered to both the same way, with a short nod and a quieter insistence that the work be done properly, because he had learned young that being trusted was the only currency he could count on. He was 35, raising his 7-year-old daughter Lily alone in the small rented house on the edge of town after his wife had passed years before. He made coffee he rarely finished and drove to a job he did well and did not love. What he loved lived somewhere underneath all of it, folded away like a recipe card he no longer had the nerve to read. Years earlier, he had wanted to cook. He had wanted more specifically and more foolishly to own a bakery. A real one, with his own name on the glass, and his own bread in the window. He had told almost no one, a dream you never say out loud can never be laughed at. And Ben had spent a long time protecting his from laughter. The person who did the laughing at Crestline Foods when laughter was required was Claire Donovan. She had taken over the company young, younger than anyone expected, and she wore that fact like armor. She was daring someone to test. To Claire, a business was a spreadsheet that happened to breathe, and every person inside it was a number that either climbed or fell. She was not cruel in the theatrical way that made for easy villains. She was worse in a sense because she was efficient. She could end a man's livelihood in the time it took to close a laptop, and she could do it without ever raising her voice, and she believed sincerely that this restraint made her fair. Ben had worked beneath her for 3 years without ever truly being seen by her. He was a line on a report labeled Quality Assurance, reliably green, and green numbers do not require attention. He preferred it that way. He came in earlier than he was asked to and left later than he was paid for, and he assumed in the plain arithmetic of a decent man that this ledger of loyalty was being kept somewhere, that it counted, that it would protect him if the day ever came when he needed protecting. That assumption was the most expensive thing he owned, and he did not know it yet. The day it came due began with a phone call at 4 a.m. The kind of call that rings differently than all the others. His mother, Helen, had collapsed in her kitchen. She lived 40 minutes away, alone, in the house Ben had grown up in, and she had raised him alone through years lean enough that he still could not throw away bread without a small flinch of guilt. Now the woman who had gone without so that he would not have to was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and a chart full of words he could not pronounce. And the doctors were using the careful, weighted language that people use when they are preparing you for the worst, without quite saying it. Ben did not think about Crestline Foods in that hospital room. He thought about it later, in the hallway, with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand, when he realized he would need time. Not much a few days, enough to move her, to speak to the specialist, to sit with her so she would not be frightened and alone, and to make sure Lily was looked after by a neighbor. He called the office before the sun was fully up, left a message explaining plainly and honestly what had happened, and asked for a short leave. He had every reason to believe he had earned. He drove in 3 days later to sign the paperwork, properly, still unshaven, still running on the thin edge of no sleep, and he was told the meeting he had scheduled had been moved. It had been moved into the open floor in front of the shift managers, in front of the very people he had trained and corrected and covered for over the years. Claire was waiting there with a folder she did not need to open because she already knew what was inside it. She told him in front of all of them that his absence had cost the department a critical audit window. She said the word reliability the way a person sets down something heavy. She said that a man who disappeared the moment things became difficult was not a man a company could build around. Ben tried to explain about his mother, about the hospital, about the message he had left. And Claire lifted one hand, not sharply, just enough, and told him that everyone had a reason, and reasons did not run a business. "We need people who show up," she said. "You didn't." He stood there in the flat fluorescent light while she thanked him for his years of service in the same tone she might have used to decline a lunch invitation. And he understood that the ledger he had trusted the careful record of every early morning and every unpaid hour had never existed anywhere but in his own head. There was no line on any report for the mornings he had come in before the ovens warmed. There was only the window he had missed, and the woman who had decided he was a liability, and the small crowd of familiar faces who looked at their shoes because they did not know where else to look. He did not raise his voice. That was not pride, exactly. It was that his voice would not have held. He handed back his badge, said something quiet that no one quite caught, and walked out through a door he had walked through more than 2,000 times. And the second it closed behind him, he stopped being a man with a career and became a man with a problem. The weeks after were the kind he would not describe to anyone later, not even when the describing might have won him sympathy. His mother's care was not cheap, and the savings he had built, one careful paycheck at a time, began to drain in a way that made him understand for the first time why his own mother had flinched at wasted bread. He thought of Lily asking why they could not go to the park as often, and the weight of that question settled deeper than any number on a bank statement. He sent out applications. He sat in waiting rooms across from men who had his resume in their hands and a certain expression on their faces. And he learned that in a town this size, word travels. And the word on Ben Callahan was that he had walked out on a good job when it counted. The truth of it did not matter. The shape of it had already hardened. He might have taken any job that came. He had almost resigned himself to it, to the long, slow rebuilding, to explaining himself in interview after interview to people who had already decided. What stopped him was not ambition. It was a Tuesday and a drive he took for no reason other than to be moving, and a building on the wrong end of Maple Street, with butcher paper in its windows and a sign in the door that read in a hand already fading that the place was closing for good. It had been a bakery once. He could see the ghost of it through the glass. The long, empty cases, the cold ovens along the back wall, the tile floor worn pale in a path where a person had stood for years, doing the one thing Ben had always wanted to do. He stood on the sidewalk longer than a sensible man would have, and the dream he had folded away and never said out loud began very quietly to unfold. He knew every reason it was foolish. He was unemployed, his mother was ill, his savings were a fraction of what they had been, and what remained was the only thing standing between him and genuine trouble for himself and for Lily. Buying a failing bakery at the exact moment his life had come apart was not a plan. It was the opposite of a plan. Any honest advisor would have told him to keep the money, take the first steady job that came, and let the dream stay folded where it could not hurt him. He called the number on the sign that same afternoon. The woman who answered sounded tired the way people sound when they have already grieved a thing before losing it. Her name was Ruth Ellis, and she had run the place for a long time. And her hands, when he met her the next morning, had the permanent flower-white creases of someone who had stopped noticing they were there. She walked him through the building with a flashlight because half the lights had gone. She showed him the oven that still worked and the two that did not. She did not oversell it. She told him plainly what was broken and what would break soon. And then she stood in the middle of the empty floor and told him she had hoped it would go to someone who understood what it had been. "It's not a good investment," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise, but it was a good bakery. There's a difference, and most people can't tell it. Ben told her he could tell the difference. It was, he realized as he said it, the truest thing he had said in weeks. He took the money he had left the careful savings meant to be a wall between his mother, his daughter, and disaster, and he spent nearly all of it. He did the arithmetic a dozen times, and it never once came out reassuring. He signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled of old coffee, and when it was done, he sat in his truck in the parking lot and put his hands on the wheel and did not drive anywhere for a long while, because he had just bet the last solid ground beneath his feet on a thing that everyone in his life would have told him not to do. He drove to the hospital that evening and told his mother. He had not planned to. He had planned to protect her from it, to let her believe he had found something steady, because the last thing a sick woman needs is a reason to worry about the son who is meant to be worrying about her. But she looked at him across the pale hospital sheets and asked what he had done. Because mothers can read a face the way Ben read a crust, and he found he could not lie to her. He told her about Maple Street. He told her the number, the real one, and he watched her do the same arithmetic he had done and arrive at the same frightening total. He waited for her to tell him he had lost his mind. He would not have blamed her. He half wanted her to, so that someone would say aloud the thing he was afraid of. Instead, Helen was quiet for a while, her thin hand resting on the blanket. And then she asked him only one question. She asked whether, if it failed, he would be able to live with having tried. Ben thought about the door at Crestline Foods and the sound that it made closing, and the years of green numbers that had counted for nothing, and the folded card he had been too afraid to read for so long. "If I fail," he said slowly, "at least I'll have failed at my own thing, not somebody else's." His mother closed her eyes then, and something in her face eased, and she told him that was the only kind of failure worth risking. She had spent her whole life failing at other people's things. She said at jobs that used her and let her go. And if she had one regret, it was that she had never once been brave enough to fail at something that was hers. She told him to go build the thing. She told him she intended to be well enough to taste it, and she wanted Lily to taste it too. He went back to Maple Street the next morning with a box of tools and no clear idea of where to start, which is the honest condition of every person who has ever begun something that matters. He tore the butcher paper down from the windows himself, and the light came into that dead room for the first time in months, and it fell across the worn path in the tile where Ruth had stood for 30 years. And Ben understood that he was standing exactly where he was meant to stand, at the beginning of a road he had chosen, rather than a road that had been chosen for him. He had no customers. He had a failing building, a dwindling account, a mother in a hospital bed, a little girl who still believed her dad could fix anything, and a reputation in town that ran precisely opposite to everything he was about to attempt. By every measure that Claire Donovan would have recognized, by every number on every report, Ben Callahan was a man who had just made the worst decision of his life. He rolled up his sleeves, found the one oven that worked, and started learning how to be right. Not almost right, exactly right at the only thing he had ever truly wanted to do. The first month nearly broke him, and it did so quietly, the way real difficulty usually arrives without drama, just a steady accumulation of things that were wrong. The bakery on Maple Street had been dying for longer than its sign admitted, and every morning Ben discovered a new symptom of that long decline. The proofing cabinet held no heat. The second oven's thermostat lied by 40 degrees in either direction depending on its mood. A pipe under the sink wept a slow brown stain across the floor, and the front door hung just crooked enough that it scraped the frame and announced every entrance with a sound like a complaint. He fixed what he could with his own hands because he could no longer afford to pay anyone else to. The savings that had once been a wall between his family and disaster were now a thin stack of bills he counted more often than was healthy, and every repair came out of that stack. He learned to solder. He learned which parts he could salvage and which he had to replace. And he learned to do the replacing at 2 in the morning when the day's baking was done and the town was asleep and there was no one to see a former quality manager on his back beneath a leaking sink. He kept a schedule that would have frightened the men who had once called him careful. He was in the bakery by 3 in the morning, mixing and shaping in the cold before the one working oven came up to temperature. He baked through the dawn, sold through the day, cleaned through the evening, and repaired through the night, and he drove to the hospital in the Gaps to sit with Helen and let her believe, from the steadiness of his face, that things were going better than they were. On the nights Lily stayed with a neighbor he still called to tell her a short story before bed so she would know he had not disappeared. She was not fooled, but she let him have the pretense because she understood it was the only rest he was getting. The town did not make it easy. Word had already decided who Ben Callahan was, and word does not update itself for anyone's convenience. People who had heard he walked out on Crestline Foods now heard he had sunk his last dollar into the Maple Street Bakery, and the two facts sat together in their minds and formed a single conclusion, which was that the man's judgment could not be trusted. They said it the way people say such things in a small place, not to his face, but in a way engineered to reach him. A bakery that failed under an owner who knew what she was doing was not going to be saved by an unemployed man with something to prove. He heard the doubt in the bell over the door, which is to say, he heard it in the long silences when the bell did not ring at all. There were mornings he baked 40 loaves and sold 6. There were afternoons when the only sound in the place was the tick of the cooling racks and his own footsteps on the worn tile walking the path Ruth had worn before him. And on those afternoons, the arithmetic in his head grew loud and specific and cruel, and he had to stand very still and remind himself of the one question his mother had asked and the answer he had given her. What saved him in the end was not a strategy. It was the bread. He had spent those brutal weeks doing the only thing he had ever truly known how to do, which was to insist on the difference between almost right and exactly right. And he had turned that insistence on his own recipes with a focus that bordered on obsession. He tested flours until his hands knew the good ones by feel. He learned the exact hour a particular dough wanted to be shaped, and the exact minute it wanted to leave the oven, and he threw away everything that was merely good in pursuit of the thing that was correct. He was not a trained baker. He was something the trained ones often stopped being, which was a man who cared about every single loaf as though it were the only one. The first customers who wandered in out of curiosity, half expecting to confirm what the town already believed, found instead a crust that shattered the right way and a crumb that tasted like something remembered rather than something bought. They came back the next day, and they brought someone. That was how it began, not with a rush, but with a rumor that finally ran in the opposite direction, one honest mouth at a time. Ruth Ellis was among the first regulars, which surprised him because he had assumed the woman who sold him the place would want to forget it existed. Instead, she came in twice a week, sat at the small counter by the window, and told him the truth about what she tasted, which was the most valuable thing anyone gave him in those months. She told him when a batch was sentimental rather than good. She told him one gray morning that he had done something with the old place that she had never managed, and that she had not expected to be glad about it, and was. By the start of the second month, the mornings that had sold 6 loaves were selling 30, and the bell over the crooked door had begun to ring in a way that no longer felt like a rarity. It was not success. It was survival, with the faint outline of a future in it, which for a man in Ben's position was very nearly the same thing as hope. Claire Donovan walked in on an ordinary Thursday, and she did not recognize the place or the man in it because she had never truly looked at either. She had come to the area on one of the market surveys she conducted personally because she trusted no one else to read a neighborhood the way she believed she could read a spreadsheet. She had parked on Maple Street by accident, seen a bakery with a modest line of people at the counter, and stepped inside out of a professional habit of examining anything that seemed to be working. She was noting the foot traffic, the price board, the small efficiencies of the room, when the man behind the counter looked up and her expression changed from assessment to something colder and more pleased. "So this is where people end up when they can't keep a real job," she said, laughing thinly, the same laugh she had used in the open floor at Crestline Foods, the one that required an audience to complete it. Ben recognized her instantly, and something in his chest tightened and then went very still. He was wearing an apron, white with flour. His sleeves were pushed up, his hands were dusted to the wrist, and he understood in a single clear moment exactly what she was saying and exactly what she had decided it meant. She looked him over the way a person looks at a cautionary tale that has arranged itself conveniently for their inspection. She remarked that she supposed everyone had to land somewhere, and that it was almost fitting, really, that a man who could not keep the job she had given him had found work baking for someone else. She said it was good that he had found something in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. She was certain, in the way she was certain of most things, that she was looking at the final chapter of Ben Callahan's story, and that the chapter was a small and slightly pathetic one. Ben did not correct her. The impulse was there, sharp and immediate, to tell her that the name on the lease was his, that the bread she was standing near was his, that the small line of people behind her had come for something he had made and not for a paycheck someone had handed him. He held the impulse and let it go. He had spent years being defined by what other people decided about him, and he had learned in the last 2 months that the fastest way to lose was to argue with a conclusion rather than to outlast it. So he served her. He asked in the even voice he used with every customer what she would like. And when she said she was only looking, he nodded and told her she was welcome to look as long as she liked. He wrapped an order for the woman behind her. He wiped the counter. He treated Claire Donovan precisely as he treated everyone who walked through his door, which was with a plain and unbothered courtesy that gave her nothing to push against. And the not pushing seemed to unsettle her more than any defense could have. She lingered a moment longer than she needed to, as though waiting for him to explain himself, to plead his case, to show her the wound she assumed she had left. When he did none of these things, she gave a small, satisfied shake of her head, the headshake of a person confirming a theory. And she left the way she had come, certain she had seen a man at the bottom of his descent. The bell over the crooked door rang behind her, and Ben let out a breath he had not known he was holding and turned back to the oven and said nothing to anyone. The thing about outlasting a conclusion is that you rarely know when it is broken. Ben did not know that Claire left Maple Street believing she had witnessed his defeat, and he did not know that the very quality that made him serve her without a word was the quality that was about to change everything. Jason Pryor came in 11 days later, and unlike Claire, he was really looking, because looking was his profession. He produced a food program that traveled the country, finding the small places that did one thing extraordinarily well: the family counters and the corner ovens that the guidebooks missed. And he had a palate that had ruined most restaurants for him, and a stubborn faith that somewhere, out past the highways, the good stuff was still being made by hand. He had heard about Maple Street the way everyone was now hearing about it from a person who knew a person, and he had driven 40 minutes on a rumor, because rumors were his whole business. He ordered without ceremony and ate standing near the window, and Ben watched him from behind the counter the way he watched every new face, without expectation, because expectation was a luxury he could not afford. Jason took one bite and stopped. He looked at the crust in his hand as though it had said something to him. He asked who the baker was, and when Ben said that he was, Jason asked where he had trained. And Ben told him the truth, which was nowhere, which was that he had spent 11 years telling other people when their bread was wrong, before he ever learned to make it right himself. Jason Pryor did not hide his astonishment, and he was not a man given to it. He told Ben that in 15 years of driving down county roads on the strength of rumors, he had tasted a great deal of good bread and a very small amount of the other thing, the thing that could not be taught, and that he was tasting the other thing now. He said he wanted Ben in the program not as a filler segment, not as a local interest curiosity, but as one of the featured artisan bakeries in an episode that would air nationally. And he explained what that kind of exposure had done for places smaller and less remarkable than this one. Ben stood very still behind his counter and understood that a door was opening, a different kind of door than the one that had closed on him at Crestline Foods, and that this one he was being invited to walk through on the strength of the only thing he had ever wanted to be judged on. He said yes before his fear could talk him out of it. Jason gave him a date a little under 2 weeks out and told him the crew would film him working film the bread and let the food carry the story, because the food, he said, was the story. In the days after the rumor about Maple Street grew a second layer, and word reached Claire the way word always reached her, filtered and second-hand and shaped by the assumptions of whoever carried it. She heard that the little bakery she had stumbled into was being noticed. She heard somewhere in the telling that Ben Callahan was involved, and she fit this new fact into the old shape of her conclusion, because minds like hers do not surrender a conclusion easily. A desperate man had taken a low job at a bakery, and the bakery was getting a moment of attention, and that was all it was. It changed nothing about the man. She was, she believed, still right about him, and being right was the thing she protected above almost all else. Then, with 4 days left before the filming, everything Ben had built began to come apart at once. The failing second oven, which he had nursed through 2 months on solder and patience, finally died in the way that no repair would fix. And it died on a night when he needed every inch of oven space he owned to be ready for a national crew. He stood in front of it at 1 a.m. with a flashlight in his teeth and his hands black with grease, and he understood that a new oven cost more money than he currently had, and that the money he did have was already promised to his mother's care, and that he was staring at a choice no man should have to make 4 days before the biggest chance of his life. The next morning brought the second blow. His flour supplier, the one whose particular grind he had spent weeks learning by feel, called to say the delivery he had built the entire filming around would be late. Badly late. Possibly not until after the crew had come and gone. Everything Ben had planned to make the loaves that had earned him the invitation in the first place depended on ingredients that were now sitting on a truck somewhere far from Maple Street with no promise of arriving in time. He sat down on an upturned crate in the middle of his quiet bakery in the gray light before the town was awake, and for the first time since he had torn the butcher paper from the windows, he felt the full weight of how far he had reached and how little was holding him up. The oven was dead, the flour was gone, his savings were spoken for, and the one chance to prove to the town and to himself and to a woman who had decided he was finished, that he had not been finished at all, was 4 days away and dissolving in his hands. He thought about the door at Crestline Foods and the sound it had made. He thought about his mother's question, whether he could live with having tried. And he understood, sitting on that crate with the light coming up over Maple Street, that he was about to find out exactly what that answer was worth. Everything he had, that was on the table. And for one long gray morning, it looked like he was going to lose all of it. He did not let himself sit on the crate for long because grief and arithmetic were both luxuries that 4 days could not afford. What he had instead was the one thing the last 2 months had taught him, which was how to be exactly right under pressure. And he began methodically to solve the disaster in the order it could be solved. The dead oven he could not resurrect, and there was no money to replace it. So he made the hard decision to stop reaching for a new one entirely and work with what he still had. He thought about the single oven that had carried him since the first week, and he did the harder math of what one oven could produce if the man running it did not sleep. It meant staggering everything baking through the night in careful waves, one batch cooling while the next proofed. A schedule so tight it had no room in it for a mistake. He would have to be flawless for 4 days on almost no rest. He had been flawless on no rest before. He knew the shape of it, The flour was the crueler problem because no amount of will could bake bread out of ingredients sitting on a late truck. He called the supplier back and did not raise his voice because raising his voice had never once solved anything. And instead, he asked plainly whether there was any portion of the order, any partial load, that could reach Maple Street before the crew arrived. He was told there might be a smaller quantity available from a nearer warehouse. Not the full grind he had built his plan around, but something close enough that a man who knew flour by feel might make it work. Close enough was not a phrase Ben had ever accepted in 11 years of quality control. But the last 2 months had taught him a second lesson, which was that insisting on perfection was worthless if it left you with nothing at all. And that a great baker was not a man who demanded ideal conditions, but a man who could find what was right hidden inside what was barely adequate. He took the partial load. He drove to the nearer warehouse himself, loaded the sacks into his truck by hand, and brought them back to Maple Street in the dark. Then he did the thing that separated him from the man he had been at Crestline Foods. He put his hands in the new flour and learned it. He mixed small test batches through the small hours, adjusting the water by feel, reading the dough the way Ruth had once read him across the empty floor, chasing the right result through a substitute he had never planned to use. It took him most of a night and a great deal of flour he could barely spare. But somewhere before the third dawn he found it. The hydration and the timing that made the lesser grind behave like the loaf that had earned him the invitation. He barely slept in the days that followed. Ruth Ellis came in on the second morning, saw the dead oven and the grease still in his hands and the particular hollowness around his eyes, and, without being asked, she took over the front counter so that Ben could stay at the bench. She did not offer sympathy, which he could not have afforded to receive. She offered work, which was the only kind of help that was any use to him then. And the two of them ran the little bakery through its most important week the way it had always been run, by hand, without margin, on the stubborn belief that doing the thing correctly still counted for something. The morning the crew arrived, Ben had been awake for the better part of 2 days, and the bakery smelled the way he had spent 2 months teaching it to smell. Jason Pryor came in ahead of his cameras, looked at the racks of finished loaves cooling in the gray light, and did not know, because Ben never told him, that 4 days earlier, the whole thing had nearly collapsed. He did not know about the dead oven, or the late truck, or the flour learned by feel in the dark. He only saw the bread, and the bread was exactly right. And the bread was the story just as he had promised it would be. They filmed Ben working his hands deep in the dough, his sleeves pushed up and his forearms white to the elbow. And they filmed the crust breaking the way a good crust should. And Jason asked him on camera the same question he had asked in private, where a man learned to bake like this. And Ben gave the same answer, which was nowhere. Which was that he had spent 11 years learning the difference between good and right before he had the courage to make anything himself. It was not a polished answer. It was a true one. And the camera, which forgives almost nothing, forgave it entirely. The segment aired 3 weeks later on a Friday night, and it was not long, no more than a few minutes inside a larger episode. But it did the thing Jason had spent 15 years driving down county roads in search of. It found the quality that could not be taught and put it in front of the whole country at once. It showed a man with flour on his hands and no training and no safety net making bread that a professional palate had driven 40 minutes on a rumor to taste. And it told underneath the food the older and simpler story of a person who had lost everything and refused to stop. The response did not build slowly the way the town's trust had. It arrived all at once, overnight, in the way that only a national broadcast can deliver. By the following morning, there was a line outside the crooked door on Maple Street that ran down the block. People who had seen a few minutes of television and driven from 3 counties over to taste for themselves. Ben sold out of everything he had by 9 and baked frantically to sell out again by noon. The bell over the door, which had once gone silent for whole afternoons, now rang so constantly that he stopped hearing it as a sound and started hearing it as weather. The town that had decided who Ben Callahan was updated its verdict the way towns do, quickly and without acknowledging it had ever held the other opinion. The man who had sunk his last dollar into a dying bakery was now the man who had put Maple Street on the map. And the same mouths that had doubted him now claimed cheerfully and without irony that they had always known there was something special about that place. Ben let them. He had learned that outlasting a conclusion meant letting people rewrite their own memories, and that arguing with the rewrite was as pointless as arguing with the original. Claire Donovan saw the segment by accident the way most turning points arrive. She was in her apartment on a Friday night with the television running for company more than attention, half working, when the food program cut to a small bakery she recognized before she understood why. Then the camera found the man behind the counter, his sleeves pushed up and his hands white with flour, and she went very still. It was the same apron. It was the same man she had stepped past on Maple Street. The one she had decided was baking for someone else. The one whose defeat she had been so certain she had witnessed. And then the program said his name. And it named him not as an employee, but as the owner, the baker, the man who had made the thing the whole country was now being told to want. She sat and watched the rest of the segment without moving. She heard him say he had trained nowhere. She heard him say he had spent 11 years telling other people when their work was wrong before he ever made anything of his own. And she understood with a slow and unpleasant clarity that those 11 years had been spent partly at her company on her floor, being reduced to a green line on a report she had never once bothered to read closely. She had held the ledger of Ben Callahan in her hands and had seen only a missed audit window, and she had thrown away the rest without ever knowing what the rest contained. The thing that reached her was not that he had succeeded. Claire respected success. It was the only language she had ever been truly fluent in. The thing that reached her was that she had been wrong, specifically and publicly, and in a way she could not spreadsheet her way out of. She had fired a man for tending his dying mother and called it reliability. She had stood in his bakery and laughed at him for a job he did not have, over a defeat he was not experiencing, and he had served her without a word and let her leave still believing it. He had not needed to correct her. The truth had simply outlasted her, exactly as he must have known it would. She went back to Maple Street on a weekday morning deliberately early before the worst of the line formed. She stood across the street for longer than she would have admitted, watching people carry white paper bags out of a door she had once swept out of in triumph. And then she made herself cross and go in. The bell rang over her the way it now rang over everyone. Ben looked up from the counter and he knew her, and whatever he felt did not show because he had spent a long time learning not to show it. She did not lead with an excuse, which was for Claire Donovan an extraordinary act of restraint. She said his name first, just his name. And then she told him she had seen the program. She said she had come to say something she should have said months earlier, and had been too certain of herself to say. She told him she had been wrong to fire him the way she had in front of everyone without letting him explain about his mother, and that calling it reliability had been a way of avoiding what it actually was, which was a decision made by someone who had stopped seeing the people on her own floor as people. "I owed you an apology a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry for how I did it and for what I decided about you, and for standing in this room and laughing at a man who'd built something I couldn't have built." Ben let the apology land before he answered it, not out of any performance of hesitation, but because it deserved to be received rather than deflected. He told her evenly that he accepted it. He meant it. He was not a man who collected grievances, and he had carried enough weight in the last months without adding hers to it. But he did not let her leave with the tidy story she seemed to want, the redemptive one, in which her cruelty had accidentally been a gift. He told her plainly that his success had not come from being fired. He said that losing his job had not been a favor and had not been a hidden blessing, that it had nearly destroyed him and his mother both, and that if the story she took from this was that her decision had done him some kind of good, then she had learned the wrong lesson from it again. What had built the bakery, he said, was not the door she closed. It was that he had refused to stop after she closed it. The credit for that belonged to him and to a sick woman who had told him from a hospital bed that the only failure worth risking was failing at your own thing. Claire took that the way a person takes a truth they cannot argue with, which is quietly and with a changed face. She had come expecting on some level to be told that everything had worked out, that the ending justified the middle. Instead, she was told that the ending had been won in spite of her, one sleepless night at a time, by a man she had written off, and that no broadcast and no line down the block could turn what she had done into anything other than what it was. She did not defend herself for once. She simply listened. She bought a loaf before she left, and she paid for it like everyone else, and the bell rang over her as she went out into the ordinary morning. And this time she did not shake her head at any theory, because the theory she had walked in with was gone. The change in Claire did not announce itself because real change rarely does. She went back to her company and to the floor she had never truly walked. And she began slowly, and against every habit she had built her whole career on, to read the reports differently. She started asking who the green lines were. She learned the names attached to the numbers and the circumstances behind the absences. And when someone came to her one afternoon needing a few days for a family emergency, she recognized the shape of the moment she had gotten catastrophically wrong once before. And she did not get it wrong again. She never told anyone why. Some lessons a person keeps privately and pays off quietly for the rest of a working life. The bakery on Maple Street did not fade after its overnight moment, the way such moments often fade. The bread held up because the bread had always been the point, and holding up was the one thing Ben knew how to make it do. Other programs called. Jason Pryor, who had made his career finding the good stuff before anyone else, took a certain proprietary pride in having found this, and he brought others. And the small place with the crooked door became one of the names people said when they talked about where the real thing was still being made by hand. Helen Callahan recovered enough to keep the promise she had made from her hospital bed, which was to be well enough to taste it. Ben drove her and Lily to Maple Street on the slow Sunday and stood them in the middle of the floor where the butcher paper had once blacked out the windows, and he watched his mother and his daughter eat the bread he had bet everything to make. And he understood that the arithmetic he had done a dozen times in his truck, the arithmetic that had never once come out reassuring, had somehow, against every number, come out right. He thought sometimes about the door at Crestline Foods and the sound it had made closing behind him, and he had stopped feeling anything sharp when he did. A door had been shut on him by someone who saw him as a line on a report. And he had spent his last dollar and his last reserve of nerve prying open a different door, one with his own name on the glass and his own bread in the window. And the second door had turned out to be the only one that had ever been his to open. Sometimes the door another person closes in your face is the very thing that forces you to build the one that was always meant to be yours. Lasting success does not come from other people's recognition, and it does not come from the moment your worst enemy is proven wrong. It comes from the plain, unglamorous courage to chase the thing you love, and from the harder courage to stand. Back up one sleepless night at a time after everything you had has been taken away.